Okay, welcome everyone to day 2 of this year's ICES Annual Science Conference. My name is Brian McKenzie. I'm going to be introducing this afternoon's keynote speaker. The speaker this afternoon is Professor Carlos Duarte. Carlos is the Tariq Ahmed Joufali Research Chair in Red Sea Ecology at the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia. And before this, he was a research professor with the Spanish National Research Council and the director of the Oceans Institute at the University of Western Australia. He also holds an adjunct position at the Arctic Research Center at the University of Aarhus in Denmark. Carlos is probably one of the most productive marine scientists of our time. He has very broad interests. He has been working on eutrophication, marine vegetation, seagrasses, plankton metabolism, biodiversity, and more general issues related to marine conservation and recovery of marine life. And it's in fact this last issue which will be the subject of his presentation this afternoon. His presentation is called Rebuilding Marine Life, a Grand Challenge and an Ethical Obligation. And I'm certainly very pleased to be able to hear and to welcome Carlos to this presentation this afternoon. So Carlos, over to you.
Thank you very much, Brian, for the kind presentation and also for ICES for the invitation to address the conference attendees today. And I'm sorry that I cannot do this in person, but we are in difficult times, but I hope to join you in the next conference in a physical presence in 3D, because now everybody has turned into 2D icons on Zoom boxes. So let me share my screen, and I will be telling you today about our options to rebuild marine life. And I must start by saying that maybe if we were holding this conference 20 years ago, I would be rather pessimistic as to the outlook of marine life and the oceans, because there wasn't really a lot of good news to be able to hold to. But something is changing, and I'm going to try to report to you what is changing and what the future might bring if we take action. So today in Marseille in France, the IUCN is holding its annual meeting, also postponed due to COVID, to assess the status of biodiversity and start discussing what our next actions and commitments are going to be. And the backdrop for this conversation is a gallery of wonderful animals and species, now counted by thousands, that we can no longer enjoy, are no longer present in the biosphere. So there's been a lot of extinctions, and particularly over the last 100 years, and some worry that the Earth's 6th mass extinction event is underway, and that we are going to see massive extinctions moving forward. This also applies to the oceans, where we have also lost a number of species. But in fact, in the oceans, the number of extinctions have been relatively few, each of them dramatical as they are, but we can count them in probably about 20 compared to thousands on land. And the main driver of extinctions in the ocean has been hunting, and continues to be hunting and bycatch. And this is illustrated by the depletion of large whales in the ocean, for which we probably have now about 10% of the historical stock present in the ocean. So 90% decline in abundance, and that can be exemplified by the humpback whale, which had pre-exploitation population sizes estimated to be in excess of 50,000 animals, and now less than a few hundred were left in 1960, around 200 to 300 left. So everybody thought that the humpback whales were earmarked for extinction. That was the consequence of hunting down large whales, starting with one species and then following with another, until the abundance of them were depleted in the ocean, and the large battleground was Antarctica. So we're still in a situation where many species are of conservation concern, and we might still see, unfortunately, some Extinctions, probably the most compromised species is the vaquita, for which there are fewer than 30 animals left. And again, overfishing and bycatch continue to be the main drivers of conservation concerns in marine species. And overall, we have experienced major losses of marine life in the oceans. About 20 species have become extinct in historical times. About 800 or so species are of conservation concern. We have seen a decline in the abundance of exploited megafauna of about 90% of their historical abundance. And then many of the fish stocks are also existing in a depleted state in the ocean. And we have lost anywhere between 1/3 to 2/3 of marine habitats. So altogether, a major loss of blue natural capital upon which the health of the ocean and also many benefits that the ocean derives to humans depend. And it's no wonder that many have been quite pessimistic about the future of the ocean, the capacity of the ocean to regenerate to a healthy state. And this is not only among scientific colleagues, but also in the general media, where some sections of the public believe that the ocean is broken beyond repair. But if we take a close look at the timeline of human pressures of the ocean, we can see that indeed hunting was the main pressure of the ocean before and during the Industrial Revolution, probably reaching a peak around the turn of the 20th century, 19th to 20th century, where also the phasing out of oil, because many of these animals were actually hunted for oil. So that's actually part of the climate crisis, and many carbon that used to be part of whales is now whales and other animals as sources of energy. So with the decline of the use of oil from animals as a source of energy, and then also with increased awareness of the impacts of hunting, then we have seen a major reduction in hunting pressures across marine life. Fishing pressure, which is another way of hunting, also reached a peak around 1990, and it has slowly declined a little bit, so it has relaxed past that peak. And likewise, deforestation that led to major changes in watersheds and inputs of sediments to the oceans reached a peak also around 1980. And while deforestation continues to be a problem, it is not really anymore increasing or at the maximum. In fact, in some regions of the world, forests are increasing in extent and mass. And habitat loss equally reached probably a maximum in terms of the rate of decline around 1980. And for many habitats, the rate of decline has slowed down. So we're seeing reduced pressure from habitat loss across many components of the ocean. Regrettably, fertilizer, plastic, and synthetic chemicals, so chemical pollution continues to increase, and so does climate change, where we have made yet no progress in reducing the current pressures, and we might still see, unfortunately, increased pressures from climate change and chemical pollution. But if we summarize this timeline on 3 blocks, we can maybe conclude that during the much of the 20th century, there was an increase in pressures leading to a decline in marine life. During the last 2 decades of the 20th century, increased awareness of the losses led to efforts to slow down pressures, reflected in many bodies of legislation and conventions, both at the regional levels, but also at the global level with the UN. And therefore, we have now, in this century and starting probably with this decade, an opportunity to rebuild marine life. And is that possible? So, in fact, we published a paper with the same title as this talk last year in Nature, called Rebuilding Marine Life, where we assess whether it is possible to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 14 that calls to conserve and sustainably use the ocean, seas, and ocean resources for sustainable development. And we documented in that paper how recovery of marine populations and habitats and ecosystems following past conservation interventions has been often successful. And then we pledged that recovery rates across studies suggests that substantial recovery of the abundance, structure, and function of marine life could be achieved within one human generation. That's about 30 years. So that means by 2050, if we took action and decisive action to reduce major pressures, including climate change. So rebuilding marine life, we concluded, represents a doable grand challenge for humanity. It is an ethical obligation, and it is a smart economic objective to achieve balance with nature. And in our paper, we put forward 5 levers to achieve this goal of rebuilding marine life by 2050. One is to protect species. The next one is to protect spaces, harvest wisely, remove pollution, and mitigate climate change. And I will add one more, because often I'm asked, what is the main threat to the ocean? And what I offer as a reply is that main threat is that we humans give up on the ocean and give up on the dream to have a healthy ocean. So don't give up on the ocean, because it has an amazing capacity to recover. And if we do take action on those 5 levers, we can still hand over a healthy ocean to our children and grandchildren. So I'd like to start with some examples of how can we be successful. And one key example is the regulation and the decrease on hunting and pressures on marine animals driven by hunting and trade regulations that have been, in my opinion, a marine conservation success. Not 100%, of course, but it has definitely made a difference. So in 1975, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species made it difficult to trade with the species that were of conservation concern, and that was followed in 1982 with a moratorium on hunting of the International Whaling Commission. And by now, out of about 90 or so, that's a 5-year-old data, 92 marine mammal populations that are being tracked, 42% are increasing, and only 10% are decreasing, and the remaining show no change. Of course, this value needs to be updated, and I believe there will be new updates coming out of the IUCN meeting in Marseille. But overall, we see a significant amount of marine mammal populations which are experiencing increases and recovering. And I'd like to come back to the humpback whale that we left in the 1970s with only about 200 to 400 animals left in the ocean and very little hope that it will escape extinction. So as a consequence of the moratorium on hunting of whales, then the levels of humpback whales in the ocean are now about 50% above the estimates in 1940. It has been downlisted from vulnerable to least concern, and the population size is probably in the order of 70 to 70,000 animals in the ocean, possibly even above historical levels. And the growth rate has been remarkable for an animal of that size. The recovery rate and the timescales have been surprising, and that brings us hope that not only the humpback whale, but many other species can recover if we release pressure on them. In fact, we have many other success stories, like the recovery of the southern sea otter from very low numbers, again, possibly placing the species on extinction levels, to a recovery across the Pacific coast of the US and Canada. And in fact, the recovery rate has slowed down because the main predator, which are white sharks and other sharks, have also increased and recovered. But again, they have been introduced to many areas where they have become locally extirpated, and they are generally doing quite well in their populations, but also performing the role, which is also to keep kelp habitats healthy. We compile a series of timelines of recovery rates for species and habitats, which show remarkable exponential rates of increase. And we also summarize the recovery times in years to achieve 90% of the pre-disturbance level across many types of species and habitats. And there's also a global value, which is a value that is the average and standard 90% confidence limits of at the right side of the figure of multiple estimates available in the literature that generally indicate that recovery times, once pressures are released, is about 2 decades across most ecosystems components, with some slow-growing ones like whales, sea turtles, and deep-sea ecosystems actually having a slowdown. And in fact, some of them might take longer than 60 years, but we don't yet have empirical evidence because we have not seen yet recovery of a species that takes more than 60 years. So modeled estimates indicate that some may require up to a century, but those are not empirically validated as yet. But even those two, whales and sea turtles, that tend to have predicted long recovery rates, we're seeing recovery across many sea turtle populations and species, and also whales, already 40 years or so after the policies that reduce pressure on them. As a result of all these actions, we see now across the ocean a fair amount of marine mammal populations which are increasing. That will be the green sectors, and then many that are experiencing no change. For instance, we see a very large sector indicating no change in Antarctica, where also pressures are relatively small, but we see a number of regions where increasing trends apply to half of the populations or even more. And if we come to fisheries and fish, first let's consider in the context of this talk that fish are wildlife, and therefore rebuilding their stocks to meet biodiversity goals should be an important goal, similar to any other species of large organisms in the ocean. A problem with the recovery of fisheries is that there's been a semantic debate because the term sustainable was introduced in fisheries modeling in the 1950s as a term that now is no longer applicable to the 21st century concept of sustainability. So I think there's been a lot of spurious debate about whether fisheries is sustainable or not, simply because it hasn't recognized that the term sustainable is dynamic and has changed over time and has become more rich and more multidimensional than it was in the 1950s. But sustainable fishing should not be only those that can support maximum sustainable yield, but it should include other elements like broader impacts on biodiversity and also social and economic components of sustainability. Stocks are generally slowly recovering, but fishing pressure needs to be reduced further. And if we reduce pressure even 10% below the fishing pressure that leads to maximum yield that can be maintained over time, I don't want to call that sustainable anymore, but that can be maintained over time, then we can achieve recovery of most fish stocks within 2 decades to 3 decades. And if we take more aggressive action on fish stocks, we can actually see recovery within shorter time scales, 1 to 2 decades. And we've seen, and it's been discussed now in Marseille, also some remarkable recovery of different tuna stocks and tuna populations. An important element is that we need to also replace catches of the small pelagics that are being used to produce flour and oil, which will allow us also to rebuild stocks, because some of these small pelagics are actually resources for the food web. So releasing the pressure on those that come from aquaculture, not from directly from human consumers, I think can also help improve the status of global fisheries. And there's one thread here with climate change, and is that we've seen, at least inferred from satellite estimates, a gradual decline in ocean productivity. So because this decline might continue with further ocean warming due to the stabilization and increased stratification of the water column that prevents a nutrient resupply, we can continue to see lower productivity, and therefore that will advise that we reduce catches even further. But very likely the rise of blue foods that is required to meet, again, sustainable development goals and maintain population healthy and free of hunger will probably come from aquaculture. But 21st century aquaculture must be different from the one we've practiced since it was industrialized about 50 years ago. It should be free of wild fishery subsidies. It should be healthy. it should be sustainable, and it should be regenerative. And I will give some pointers as to what I mean by these terms. So about 20 million tons of wild catches are used to produce fish flour and oil, which are in turn only delivering 5 million tons of fish coming from aquaculture. This is obviously unsustainable, and that needs to stop. So we need to close the production cycle within the farm and generate a self-sustaining food web, formulating feed for fish from algae and small invertebrates. So that's an absolutely must if we should achieve an aquaculture system in the 21st century that is sustainable. It needs to be healthy, so that means that we should not interfere on the marine food web and introduce elements of the land food web in the marine food web, like for instance feeding salmon with soybean, because all of the health benefits associated with seafood are actually not produced by the fish themselves. They are produced by microbes, and they reach our table and our diet through fish and other elements. It also should be free of pollutants, and that is an important target in where aquaculture is placed. It needs to be sustainable, and to make aquaculture sustainable, we need to lower the trophic levels of exploitation, and then we also need to promote human development goals and societal development goals within aquaculture industry. So that little cartoon in the right, which has been reproduced a number of times, shows the food web, for instance, at the level at which tuna occurred. So if we make a parallel to the terrestrial food web, a tuna will be a monster that will feed on wolf, that will feed on herbivores. So we don't really exploit terrestrial food webs at those levels. They actually probably do not exist, even in the terrestrial food web. But every time we go one step up, we lose 90% of production. So if we just push down the level of the food web at which we exploit aquaculture, we can actually increase the yield while reducing impacts. So aquaculture must be regenerative, and that means that it should provide habitat to increase biodiversity. It should sequester carbon like seaweed aquaculture can do. It should improve water quality, protect shorelines, subsidize wild populations, provide shelter. For instance, seaweed aquaculture provides shelter against ocean deoxygenation and acidification, and should also displace plastic pollution. And right now, there are different companies producing polymers that displace single-use plastics from seaweed-based polymers. So aquaculture can do all of this and much more, and can contribute to supply healthy diets to humans while we release the pressure on wild stocks. So harvesting wisely implies that, again, recognizing that fish are wildlife and including them within our post-2020 biodiversity goals as a species, not as food. And then we should also recognize that the connection to the marine food web brings about huge health benefits to humans, reproductive benefits, mental health benefits, and coronary health benefits. So often I'm involved in conversations where the question of whether we should continue to eat fish or meat, or we should go for vegan diets as being climate friendly or biodiversity friendly are raised. My response is that the role of a diet is actually to maintain us healthy. So we should first make sure that our diets are healthy, and then source those healthy diets with the least possible impact to ecosystems, and if possible, only with positive impacts. We need to reduce fishing pressures below the pressure that maintains the maximum yield that can be maintained without collapsing the stock. We need to lower the trophic level of harvest. We need to reduce waste. And there are many emerging concepts coming from the food industry, but also celebrity chefs, of how to use and give value to parts of seafood that were being discarded as waste. We need also to develop new and sustainable blue foods. And for instance, this year, there's been the advent of a new cereal coming from a seagrass called marine rice that can be produced and grown while regenerating seagrass meadows. and also it needs to close the production cycle within agriculture farms. On pollution, I indicated that we haven't really done much progress on pollution because many forms of pollutions have been regulated, but we continue to introduce new chemicals in the ocean that continue to impact on marine life. And due largely to inputs of sewage and also excess agricultural fertilizer to the ocean, we lost seagrasses at very accelerating rates during the 20th century, with the rates accelerating every decade until the end of the century and reaching very large loss rates, to the point that early this century we were talking of a global crisis for seagrass ecosystems, where the conservation was again threatened by pollution of our waters, but also mechanical impacts and other impacts as well. But recently there's been a wave of reports that show recovery in different estuaries and coastal waters across the world due to action taken typically in the 1980s and 1990s to reduce nutrient inputs. So this example of seagrass recovery comes from Tampa Bay in Florida, but we also have similar reports coming again on the last decade from Chesapeake Bay in the US as an outcome of reducing nutrient inputs. And also we see large expansions of seagrass meadows in the coastal waters of the US, this time propelled by active restoration. And also across Europe, we documented a couple of years ago that for the first time in 1 century, there was a recent trend reversal from declining to expanding seagrass meadows across Europe. So in the first decade of this century, rather than continue to decline, seagrass meadows around Europe expanded by about 18%, which is not a small number. And that shows that the policies introduced to conserve seagrass meadows, to reduce nutrient inputs, are working, although it does take time for the benefits to be seen and reflected in this case, expanding seagrass meadows. So this is the data. I would draw your attention to the black line that shows below the dotted line is losses, negative rates, and above the dotted line, which we only see in the first decade of this century, we see an 18% expansion of seagrass in Europe. And I think that expansion is going to continue because more recent data show further expansion, and also we are seeing now a rise of restoration efforts across Europe. We can now also focus on another habitat of concern, which is mangrove forest, of which we lost 40% between 1950 and 2014. And already by 1950, we had lost a lot of the historical extent of mangrove, but it kind of declined very rapidly. And the decline rates were about 2.2% per year, which is 4 times faster than the decline of tropical forest. But if we add a little bit of a granularity to this figure, then we can see that the decline rates have actually slowed down. So the last figure actually is a very slow decline rate of only 0.3% per year, probably not statistically significant. Newer data show that we are not seeing global loss of mangroves across the ocean anymore. And in many regions of the ocean, mangroves are actually expanding, as they do where I work in the Red Sea, where they have expanded by 13% over the last 30 years. So there's been different reasons why mangroves are expanding. First, we saw a first example that restoration at the scale was possible in the Mekong Delta mangrove forest, which is the largest ecosystem restoration yet attempted by humans. So during the US war, as the Vietnamese referred to it, then the US Air Force destroyed about almost 3,000 square kilometers of mangrove in the Mekong Delta by releasing fertilizers and also napalm incendiary bombs across this mangrove forest. And between 1970 and 1998, so within 2 decades, then the Vietnamese people replanted about 2,700 square kilometers of these mangroves. And I've been working on this mangrove forest In fact, I took that photograph that we see in 1997, and unless you were a trained botanist, you would not be able to ascertain that you were not working or walking on a pristine mangrove forest. And a recent assessment showed that this mangrove restoration actually contributed to regenerate an important carbon sink that amounts to 5 years of annual emission of Vietnam. So it's not only the biodiversity benefits, but also significant climate benefits that were derived from the restoration effort. And it was done with very, very simple means and very meager resources. So we can indeed restore at scale. And the next event on the story of the slowdown of mangrove loss came with the Indian Ocean tsunami of the 26th of December of 2004, which was a catalyst of the awareness of the value of mangroves. So you may remember that we lost about 250,000 human lives in that tsunami across Indonesia, India, Thailand, Malaysia, and many other nations in the Indian Ocean. But it was quickly resolved that in the villages where a pocket of mangrove remained between the village and the coastal water, there were almost no human casualties. And governments then initiated large-scale mangrove plantation programs to defend human lives and infrastructure in the shorelines. And in fact, mangrove plantation is very easy and it's also very cost-effective. So that was done at scale in the region. And a third element propelling conservation of mangroves has been the concept of blue carbon. So recognizing the role as very intense carbon sinks, and then seeing an opportunity in their conservation restoration to propel climate action. So blue carbon refers to the strategy to derive mitigation and adaptation co-benefits to the conservation and restoration of seagrass and mangrove ecosystems, and is currently a main driver of restoration efforts across these habitats. So in fact, what blue carbon does is that we look at this very busy figure that shows what is it that we need to do to meet our climate goals, which is to reduce emissions, to reuse and recycle carbon dioxide. We also need to remove excess carbon dioxide that is already in the atmosphere. And we can do that through technology fixes, or we can do that through what is called nature-based solutions. And I also have a little whale painted there because whales can actually, if we do recover the stock of large whales, that can also contribute to enhancing the capacity of the ocean to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But nature-based solutions can be defined as an effort to decarbonize the atmosphere to recarbonize the biosphere. And that means increasing the stocks of living carbon and rebuilding the natural capital of the biosphere, both on land and the ocean. So restoring the abundance of life in the ocean is not only contributing to biodiversity goals, it also can have significant contributions to achieving our climate goals. So if we go back to this trend of decline of mangroves, then we see that basically we are now at a trend shift where we have slowed down the losses, and now we're seeing a net expansion of mangroves across many regions. And we have here depicted two possible trajectories of recovery, one very optimistic and one that is not so optimistic, at about 1% per year or 1.5% per year. We believe that both of them are feasible if we are able to deploy the resources and the governance mechanisms that will be required. So we believe that by 2050, we should be able to recover anywhere between 60 to 100% of the historical extent of mangrove forests, which will be quite a major achievement. We see that much of what is happening is actually happening in the 21st century. So I mentioned that if I was giving this talk in year 2000, I would be rather pessimistic about our capacity to restore the abundance of life in the oceans, because rebuilding the abundance of life in the oceans is really a 21st century phenomenon. So just take a look at these animations of the spread of marine protected areas around the ocean between 1960 and also the number of restoration projects of marine habitats and moose roaming around the ocean. So In the 1980s, we already had significant efforts at protecting marine areas and restoring marine habitats as well. But it's really after the turn of the century where these efforts really increased greatly in number and scale and ambition. And by 2 years ago, when I compiled these estimates, we have achieved a huge increase in the number of restoration projects and the marine protected area globally. So this is actually the same data, but plotted as timelines. And we can see that at the turn of the century, we only had 0.4% of the area of the oceans protected. We should be close, hopefully this year, to achieve 10% with 1 year delay relative to the IC targets if we get Antarctica protected. And then if we continue, we can easily achieve at the same rate 30% by 2030, and why not even 50% by 2050. And on the right side of the screen, that you can see the number of projects of habitat restoration documented in the literature. And then you can see really a sharp rise between 1990 and year 2000 across all habitats. So we have definitely entered the century, not just a decade, the century of ecosystem restoration. And now things like blue carbon are actually mobilizing huge amounts of financial investments and resources to propel restoration further. And marine protected areas, as we increase them, they contribute not only to local benefits, but again, they do contribute to climate action. And in this paper led by Callum Roberts in 2017, we summarize the multiple ways in which marine protected areas contribute to climate action and to not only mitigate climate change, but also to improve adaptation of marine ecosystems and coastal areas to climate change. So as we protect marine areas, we also have co-benefits in terms of climate action and co-benefits in terms of many other outcomes, including societal benefits and improved livelihoods. But there's one element which I find quite hard to have a positive outlook on. Well, there's two elements. One of them is sea ice ecosystems, which are on decline. And for sea ice ecosystems, I don't really think we can be very optimistic that we can improve them. Probably we'll continue to see significant declines in sea ice ecosystems. But in the tropics, far away from the polar regions, we are struggling to keep coral reefs healthy. And in our opinion, rebuilding coral reefs carries the highest risk of failure because of the cumulative pressures on them, but more recently because we are trespassing the thermal thresholds to maintain healthy coral reefs. And we're seeing global bleaching events with new marine heat waves that are almost globally synchronous. So the pressures on coral reefs have grown over time, and at present we have probably lost about 50% of the historical extent of coral reefs. They are either lost or degraded, but the IPCC projects that even if we are able to contain climate change to 1.5 degree over industrial temperatures, for which we only have 0.3 degree to go before we reach that threshold, we are likely to lose 75 to 90% of remaining coral reefs. I have a little bit of issue with empirical support for that statement, but nevertheless, that's what you can find in the 2018 and 19 IPCC reports on the 1.5 degree report and also the Oceans and Cryosphere report. So that is now a huge threat to coral reefs coming from climate change. And many have lost hope and accepted that we will lose coral reefs. So this is actually from an editorial in the New York Times already 10 years ago. And the editorial is entitled "A World Without Coral Reefs." This is just a passing of the editorial that it reads, "It's past time to tell the truth about the state of the world's coral reefs. There is no hope of saving them." So, for instance, now you can buy packages to visit the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, which are commercialized as last chance trips. So they are commercializing these packages as your last chance to go and see the Great Barrier Reef, because it will be gone in 10 years. And I find that really sad. And I don't want to, at least from my very small contribution, to see coral reefs go without a good fight. So our take on that, and that was an editorial that I co-authored with Calvin Roberts and Nancy Knowlton, is that we should not accept the loss of coral reefs and grief. We must take action. And then we quoted a singer Joan Baez in saying that action is the antidote to despair. So what action can we take? There's actually action we can take to protect coral reefs. And we can consider that coral reefs can also be quite resilient in recovering from major disturbance. So in the Marshall Islands nuclear test in the 1950s, 76 megatons, equivalent to many Hiroshima bombs, were exploded over the Marshall Islands, and it created huge craters, and the deepest one of them was 73-meter depth. And the experiment involved raising surface seawater temperatures to 55,000 degrees centigrade. So that was a sterilization experiment, and there were blast waves that reached 30-meter high, and reached the impact, reached the seafloor. So nothing survived that nuclear test. But after 30 years, 40 years, now the coral reefs inside that test zone are actually healthier than the reference coral reefs. And that led Lawrence, in a paper published in 2015, to conclude that while nuclear testing is devastating an acute time scale, it may prove to be beneficial to the local ecosystems over a more chronic duration through human exclusion. It took me 2 or 3 times to read this sentence to understand what Lawrence was trying to say. And it was really talking about the pervasive impacts of cumulative impacts on coral reefs. But I want to flip this around and just celebrate the amazing recovery of coral reefs over 40 years from a complete sterilization of the seafloor across a very, very large area. So I think we shouldn't give up, and we should learn from and build with that resilience. And last year, the G20 organized a workshop called Advancing Global Coral Reef Conservation, where the main conclusion was that the window for the protection of the world's coral reef ecosystems is narrow and is rapidly closing, and that there is no single nation that has the capacity to revert the situation, so that international collaboration is key. And the solutions that can be elicited can be to reduce multiple pressures, to repair key processes, include herbivory larval recruitment, and also to manage coral reefs for resilience. But it will take more than that to secure a future to coral reefs. I think a new ambition is in order, and that new ambition should move away from the projected loss of almost 90% of coral reefs, in the best of cases, by year 2035. And we should push the boundaries of what is possible and look for not just no zero loss, but perhaps even a 10% increase of coral reefs over the next 15 years. So I'm happy to share that in 30th of June this year, the outcome of the discussions of the G20 on how to collaborate to save coral reefs came to fruition, and the Global Coral Reef R&D Accelerator Platform held its inaugural meeting, and I was appointed executive director to this platform. And this is an all-hands-on-deck effort to bring scientists and technologies from around the world to be able to generate the next best science and technology that saves coral reef, because that projection of 75 to 90% loss is under the best current science and technology available. So that is not good enough, and we need to collaborate to create a new capacity to not only conserve but also support and recover coral reefs. So we're now creating an R&D program that will be international and collaborative to achieve this goal, through creating a new community of practice that brings together marine ecologists, but also engineered technologists and innovators to meet this challenge. We also would like to engage with the capacities of the private sector and then share information across research in real time, because we don't have time to waste, and also improve training for R&D of coral reef restoration, conservation, and share facilities and infrastructure, while also developing new tools and providing access to scientists from developing countries to cutting-edge facilities. So eventually we hope to deliver within the next few years new tools to managers and communities to be able to conserve and restore the coral reefs at scale. So we are now ramping up the effort, and we hope to have the first call for proposals towards the end of this year. As a conclusion, I would like to emphasize that rebuilding marine biodiversity by 2050 is actually possible, but it is a grand challenge. So it's very hard to achieve, but it's possible. And I would like to offer that conserve and sustain is no longer acceptable. And in the 1990s with the Earth Summit, then the concept of conserving and sustaining was embedded as the main mantra. But what it really meant is that every year we were losing 1%, 0.5%, 2%. So we were losing ground, and 20 to 30 years later, we've seen major loss. So our ambition can no longer be to conserve and sustain, it must be to rebuild. And marine biodiversity can be rebuilt by 2050 around the levels of abundance that we have in 1860. And the time window to do that is the next decade. So if we don't get this job done by 2030, we will lose an opportunity, and I'm afraid we will then be handing a broken ocean to our children and grandchildren. So it does require huge collaborative efforts across scientists, governments, businesses, NGOs, and also opinion leaders to achieve this. The cost is estimated to be 10 to 20 billion US dollars per year. Very likely this investment is already in the ground, but it's not used effectively, and it's not used in a way that scales up the benefits. And this is only about 0.01% of the global GDP. It's not much for what the benefit will be. And it actually be cost effective, because for every dollar invested in rebuilding marine life, we calculate there will be monetized benefits of about $10. So it's actually a very good business proposition, and it's a solid financial strategy, but requires effective leadership. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Carlos, for this very interesting and stimulating presentation. I think we might have a time for a question or two. There's a couple of questions which have come in through the chat. I will try to read them out to you, and maybe you can take them. Actually, they're a bit long. Oh, here's a bit shorter one. How can we integrate fishery science and IUCN red listing efforts effectively, especially with the different approaches to precaution and data quality? And that is actually from Mark Dickie-Collis of ICES.
So data quality is an issue, and across many fisheries, particularly in developing nations and artisanal fisheries, we don't have really high quality data to be able to even assess the status of the fisheries. But eventually, I think I highlighted some efforts that will be required. So many of these developing nations actually depended on the small pelagics that are now being co-opted by the aquaculture industry to produce fish, flour, and oil. So I think we need to leave those small pelagics in the ocean, both for the benefit of people and for marine food webs. So that will be one step. But I see that in the future, let's say the next 30, 40 years, in that future, I see a transition similar to that we made on land, where hunting is no longer, except in some communities, hunting is no longer the main mode by which we procure our food. So it's actually the food is produced in a controlled way. So I really think that we will phase out much of fishing and then scale up aquaculture. But to do that, we require a new concept for aquaculture. But the benefit for that is that we are doing this transition 10,000 years after we made the transition on land, and we should learn from those mistakes and don't repeat it again. So I think that we should push for as strong conservation goals for fish that are targeted by fisheries as we are for any other marine species. They should not be treated differently, and we need to accelerate our efforts to build a truly sustainable aquaculture industry that can feed the world with healthy diets.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to wrap up the keynote address and the questions for now. Once again, I would like to thank Carlos for making this very interesting and stimulating presentation. It also has a lot of optimism in it for us, and I think all of us here within the ICES network and more generally in the scientific community, the marine science community, we have our work cut out, at least for the next 10 years or so, to try to realize these visions that Carlos has set out for us here this afternoon. So once again, I would like to thank you, Carlos. It's a pleasure to hear you speak about this, and I'm sure there'll be many other questions, and maybe you'll get some comments or some emails about your presentation in the next few days or so.